So Tony has been interested always in history and did an MA in history at the University of Exeter. At present, he is the convener of the Crediton and District U3A History Society and has done a couple of talks for us already. And he's published recently a history of the Lawrence Chapel and Hospital, which is a subject he talked about earlier in these Kazoon talks. He's currently working on a museum exhibition in Crediton, planning for 2023, which will be focused on the remarkable 1743 map of the fire when Crediton asked for the fire. He also has become a trustee of the Devon and Cornwall Record Society and is involved in several projects with them. So without more ado, I'll pass you over to Tony.
Thank you, Sue. Okay, good afternoon to you all. Today we're going to be talking about the Copplestone. I guess most people who live or work in the Crediton area will be aware of this stone. Here it is standing in the middle of the road on the A377, which, as most of you know, is the main road between Crediton and Barnstaple. It stands in the middle of the village called Copplestone, which was a very small village until quite recently. The stone itself is not recent, not by a long shot. The earliest known record of it comes from over 1,000 years ago. That's rather special. Let's look at it in rather more detail. Oops, for some reason, this isn't there. What's happening now? Isn't this always the way? Come on. My screen has frozen on me now. There we go. I believe this is the oldest recorded monument in mid-Devon. The oldest recorded decorated monument in mid-Devon. By decorated, I mean a stone with a complex design carved on it. There may be some pre-Norman fragments in one or two local churches, a couple of fonts perhaps, but in terms of a standalone monument, I can't think of anything older than this. The earliest documentary record we have of the stone is dated from 974 CE. It's mentioned in a land grant. If you were buying or selling land these days, you would have a location map. But in 974, which as you'll appreciate is 100 years before Doomsday, in 974 they didn't have pictorial maps. Instead, they used word maps to describe the boundaries of the land in question. Word maps typically begin and end at what Nicholas Howe called a well-defined and isolatable site. In other words, a clear and distinctive location. In this case, the boundary clause begins first to Copplestone Stan, from that stone westwards along the high road. So we know that it was there in 974, that it was recognized as a distinctive feature in the landscape, and that it was called the Copplestone Stan. Now, what I should have mentioned is that that boundary clause is written in Old English. And one of the problems you encounter when you're trying to understand documents in Old English is that place names can be interpreted in different ways. The Stan part of the name is straightforward enough. It means, you guessed, stone. But Copplestone could be interpreted as meaning chief or crested or even rocking. W.G. Hoskins favoured crested, suggesting that the top of the stone probably originally rose to a crest. It's clearly been altered. The stone has clearly been altered at some point during its long history, so we can't be sure. There's a good argument for suggesting that Copplestone might mean chief or principal. It was certainly an impressive and highly decorated monument, which suggests that it signified something very important. Hoskins went on to suggest an association with an earlier landmark somewhere in this area, a noteworthy tree referred to as the Egersan Treal, or Tree of Terror, in the Great Charter of 739 CE. I have to say that most recent commentators disagree with that suggestion, and they suggest that the Tree of Terror lay somewhat further west on the Oakhampton Road. But nonetheless, there was obviously something important about this area before the land grant of 974, if there was something called a Tree of Terror here early in the Saxon era. Purists might wish to know that the stone was re-sited in the 20th century. As the volume of road traffic increased, it was deemed to be an obstacle and was moved to improve traffic flow. It was marginally realigned at that time, but you can see how little it was moved by comparing these two photographs. And it was lowered. As you can see, it was originally, if I move my cursor here, on that sort of truncated pyramidal base. An article published in by the Devonshire Association in 1876 says that it had been raised on, quotes, a sloping base of modern masonry for the purpose of preserving the stone about 30 years since. So it had already been moved once. It had been raised on that base somewhere in the 1840s or thereabouts. But when the stone was moved in the 1960s, the local press managed to make a good story out of it. They found one of the locals, to come out with a gloriously eccentric sounding quote, which was just great for the newspapers. "Beware," she said, "there's a curse on anyone who moves that stone." Gosh. Now, I said there was something important about this location. Traditionally, this stone is regarded as being at the centre of Devon. Well, clearly there are several ways of measuring the centre of a very irregular shape. So that's debatable. But what we can say is that the Copplestone lies on a major watershed. As a local resident said to me, "If you buy a pint in the pub there and tip it upside down by the stone, half of it will end up in the Bristol Channel and the other half in the English Channel." Well, that's a slight exaggeration, but this genuinely is a point on the watershed between the catchment of the Tor, which flows north, and the Credi X system, which flows south. Water and watercourses have been important to cultures since the beginning of history. So there's some merit in suggesting that this might be one reason for siting a monument here. We've already mentioned that it has been a boundary marker for over 1,000 years. That land grant of 974 was a relatively trivial transfer of ownership, but when the counties were divided up into hundreds at some unspecifiable point before the Norman conquest, the Copplestone was a marker on the boundary between Crediton Hundred, shown on this map in green, and North Taunton Hundred, shown in pink. When parishes were established later in the medieval era, the Copplestone was acknowledged as being at the meeting point of 3 parishes: Crediton, Colebrook, and Down St Mary. So what I'm saying is that this is all evidence that this stone has featured as an important boundary marker throughout that 1,000-year history. The other possibility that we have to consider is that it might have started out as a commemorative monument, a memorial, if you like. We'll come to see in a minute that various commentators have suggested this, exploring the idea from a number of angles. But that's an element of the story, the second part of this presentation. Before we get into that, we need to look more closely at the stone itself. One of the first things you'll notice is that it's a big chunk of stone. It's made from granite. Geologists tell us that that granite came from Dartmoor, almost certainly from Merivale, which is on the west side of the moor. That's about 30 miles from Copplestone. So transporting that huge chunk of stone 1,000 years ago would have been a very big undertaking. Here's my sketch showing the location and the orientation of the stone. I'm showing you this not just to confirm where it is in relation to the road network, but also because in order to describe the decoration on the stone, we'll be referring to the 4 faces as being northwest, southwest, southeast, and northeast, as marked around that little diamond shape as it looks there in the middle of the map. So, what do we know about the decoration? Well, in recent years, a team from the University of Durham has been going around the country compiling a very comprehensive set of books called the Corpus of Anglo-Saxon Stone Sculpture. They do a really, really thorough job of describing stones like this. Here's what they say about the northwest face, which is the first of the photographs on this slide. Starting from the top, they say we have a curious pattern of 3 chords forming a series of twists and loops, Romilly Allen 552, 4 registers of paired ring knots, Romilly Allen 577, compare St. Neot, and an 8-strand plain plait, common. Wow. So the first thing you'll notice is that they are codifying and classifying all those different patterns. As to all that Romilly Allen stuff, we'll look at that in a minute, but just notice that on this face we have 2 panels recognized as distinct Romilly Allen patterns and a 3rd described as common. They also draw attention to a similar pattern on the middle panel appearing on a stone at St. Neot in Cornwall. Those complex patterns don't come out of nowhere. If you've ever tried copying an interlaced pattern, you know how difficult it is to draw, let alone carve. And if you've got one that works, and you know how to copy it, you save yourself a lot of trouble using it again instead of designing a new one from scratch. Now, when it comes on to the southwest face, which is the photograph next to it there, so we've turned almost through 90 degrees, it's the one that faces the prevailing weather. 1,000 years of sou'westerlies have eroded that decoration so much that it's very difficult to make anything out, which is why the corpus calls it clear and eroded. But an antiquary called Sir Henry Dryden made the earliest known drawing of decoration on the stone, which was first published in 1876. And Dryden came up with this, excuse me, I'm just trying to make sure I've got it on the screen there. Dryden came up with this interpretation of the southwest face. You'll see how much weather damage has been done in the last 150 years or so. And you'll also notice how Dryden struggled to interpret the interlaced patterns. The basic rule is that you should be able to follow the thread or threads as they go under and over all the way around the pattern. He tried, I'm very glad he tried, but he couldn't work it out. We'll come back to talk about him later. If we turn to the southeast face, the corpus team from Durham tell us that we can see the top of the stone is broken, possibly when a socket was made for a crosshead and then subsequently broken out, which is why we've got that sort of gash in the middle of the stone there. And again, corpus suggests that may be a later addition to the stone. There's a niche in the top panel. Again, that appears to be a later addition as it cuts through the original decoration. Broadly speaking, if you look at the panels below it, the one above, you can just see some sort of outline of an earlier decoration which is being cut through by that niche. It was probably made to hold a figure, more than likely the figure of a saint, but we have no further details or evidence about that. Then we turn to the lower panels. The middle one is 5 registers of surrounded knots, and the lower one has 2 panels of key pattern arranged diagonally. That's these 2 down here, looking a bit like elaborate swastikas. These are described as being Romilly Allen 867, and we have a comparison which is Toyser's Cross at Exeter. So we've now got more Romilly Allen patterns, and we've got comparisons with a known stone from Exeter. Turning around again, we now have the northeast face, which is arguably the most interesting of them all, because it contains, or contained, being somewhat eroded, contained 2 picture panels. Starting this time at the bottom, if I may, we have what the corpus team describe as an 8-chord pattern Romilly Allen 565. In the middle panel, we have what's described as two standing figures embracing. It's quite difficult to make that out now, but we'll see in a little bit how we might be able to interpret that. So the corpus notes that various commentators have suggested that this might represent something from the Bible, perhaps the visitation, perhaps Adam and Eve, or possibly a reconciliation involving two secular figures. And finally on this panel, at the top, we have a horseman in profile, with something unclear above and behind his head. There's been quite a bit of speculation about what this might represent, which we'll explore when we talk about the story. Just for a moment, if I may, I wanted to show you something to explain all these references to Romilly Allen. If you thought I was a bit geeky about historical monuments, you should see what this man did. Here are a couple of examples of his drawings. They are painstaking. He was an excellent graphic artist. And if you want to discover how it's possible to follow the thread or threads as they go under and over, all the way around the patterns, use one of his drawings. I've included a link to the website where you can find more of these if you should be interested in doing so. And you'll recall that Mr. Romilly Allen classified recurring patterns. Here's one page from another of his books where he illustrates 6 similar triangular segments, which are all variations on a theme. And look, here's the lower panel from the southeast face of the Copplestone, and you can see that it's Romilly Allen 867, but inside out. So if you look at the lowest triangle, if you like, of that one, you'll see it's the same pattern as that. If you've been paying attention, I hope you have, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that this is the one which also appears on Toyce's Cross, which is the stone from Exeter. Now, Toyce's Cross is in the Albert Memorial Museum in Queen Street in Exeter. It's nothing like as imposing as the Copplestone, but it's well worth looking at for the purposes of comparison. In particular, we want to look at this one here, which is the same as one of the panels on there. And below, there's like a double panel reworking of the same basic design. Now, being flippant just for a moment, I can't help noticing that hidden in this design is something that looks spookily 20th century. This has to be the earliest known example of the Superman logo. Yeah? We can just try that again if you like. Just turn it off, and there it is again. Once you've noticed it, very, very difficult to unsee. So, enough about the painstaking Mr. Romilly Allen. Here's the complete set of drawings of the Copplestone presented by Sir Henry Dryden. Now, as I said before, he had problems with the interlace, but you'll now notice that he also had problems with drawing faces. The two figures embracing on the southeast face here were much less eroded when he made those drawings, but his depiction of their faces is unsettlingly childlike, which is a great shame, really, because this is one of the two panels which might help us to decode the stone and understand more about its origins. Now, as you will notice, the corpus team from Durham have done a lot of detective work to find comparative examples. They draw attention to this Yorkshire example, which you can see in the Museum of Yorkshire. Once again, it's partially eroded, but I think you will agree that it's very similar to the scene from the Copplestone. The corpus team describe it as depicting two secular figures embracing. And what about that horseman in profile? The top panel on the northeast face of the Copplestone. Well, there are relatively few depictions of horsemen on Anglo-Saxon stones, and no one has identified a close comparator. but the corpus team comment that the figure on horseback, probably blowing a horn, could well be the image of a secular ruler, such as are found on northern crosses of the Viking Age. Here's a photograph of something similar from Chesterley Street. Other commentators have suggested Christian imagery, including Christ's entry into Jerusalem, or perhaps a contemporary, which I mean 10th century, religious figure. So let's just pause for a moment here and look back over what we've learned about the stone. This was a significant monument when it was set up. Somebody took the trouble to transport an enormous chunk of granite all the way from Dartmoor to Copplestone. It was erected in a location which sits on an important watershed, and it's acted as a boundary marker for more than 1,000 years. The stone was decorated by a skilled stone carver or carvers who had knowledge of intricate designs which were also used on other monuments. Some of the decoration, in particular the two pictorial panels, depicted characters and scenes which must have meant something important to whoever commissioned and erected the stone. So this is the point where we move on from describing the stone itself to talk about the story or stories which have grown up around it. Let's think about, for a moment, the antiquarian movement, which had its origins way back in the 16th century, gathered pace in the 17th and 18th, and by the 19th century became one of the most popular aspects of British history. The antiquarians took particular interest in historical documents and ancient monuments, many of which had gone unnoticed or at least unregarded in earlier writing. The first reference I can find to the Copplestone is a short article which accompanies this slightly sort of skew riff drawing by Samuel Pratt. It says that the origins of the stone were uncertain. From its situation, probably intended for a parochial boundary or possibly a landmark for the family of Copplestone. Well, okay, boundary mark. We then have quite a gap until we come to a substantial article by R.A. King in the Transactions of the Devonshire Association in 1876. King was the first person to discuss the recently discovered land grant of 974 and its reference to the Copplestone. Again, he leaned towards the idea that it was probably a boundary stone, but he added the comment that it might have served as a religious gathering place in the very big parish of Crediton. King noted the intricate stone carvings, commenting that they had much in common with Celtic or Scandinavian stones elsewhere in the country, and he presented Dryden's lithographs to illustrate his paper. It was King who suggested that the two embracing figures in the lower pictorial panel might represent Christian imagery, Adam and Eve, or possibly the Visitation, but he felt that this was not at all clear. He felt that it was not at all clear what is meant to be represented by the figure on horseback in the uppermost panel. The story of the stone and its origins then took a very different turn just 2 years later, when a man called R.E. Way published an article in the Journal of the British Archaeological Association in 1878. Way made a dramatic claim. I'm sorry, this is quite a long quote, but this really is a turning point in the way that the story of the stone has been told. So Way said, as this stone stands at the boundary of the parish of Crediton, it might have been erected at the period the Saxon Charter, that's the Saxon Charter of 974. The Saxon Charter refers to by Ulfhere the Thane or by the monks of Crediton to mark the limits of their respective lands. But, he says, if it is a memorial cross, which I believe it to be, then we must assign it to the time of King Edward the Elder or Athelstan, so somewhere between 901 and 940 AD. For it is recorded that Putta, the second Bishop of Devon, who held his see at Bishop's Taunton, while on a journey to Crediton to visit the king or Uffa, Earl of Devon, was slain by some of the Earl's followers. On what part of the journey between Bishop's Taunton and Crediton this occurred, it does not appear, but as this cross stands on that very route, the sculpture agreeing with the period, and the emblems also proving it to be a Christian relic, I think we may fairly assume that the figure on horseback on the northeast side was intended to represent Bishop Putter on that eventful journey, and most probably marks the spot where the bishop lost his life, and that it was set up, no doubt, by a succeeding prelate. Well, you might notice that there are several ifs, assumes, and as I believes in this statement, but there's no doubt that Way is staking a claim for this version of the story. He says that it might be a boundary stone, but he believes that it is a memorial. He says that it must date to early 10th century because that's when Bishop Putter was murdered on the journey to Crediton, and the figure on the horseback must represent Putter. And although there's no other evidence of where that murder took place, it must have been here. The emblems are Christian, the cross lies between Crediton and Bishop's Taunton, so it must be a memorial to Putter's murder. Now that's a big claim, and rather a series of big claims. And when somebody comes up with a radical new interpretation like that, it's worth asking where his idea might have come from. Well, the Bishop Putter story comes from John Hooker, no less. John Hooker was the first person to write, to compile a history of Exeter, which makes his version of events very important. Although, of course, they might not be accurate. He was writing towards the end of the 16th century. He says that Werstanus, the first bishop of Devon, based his see at Bishop's Taunton, and that Putter, on the death of Werstanus, was elected and consecrated bishop, and taking a journey towards Crediton to see and visit the king, or as some say Uffa, the king's lieutenant, was by the said Uffa's men slain. Well, that's a dramatic story, a bishop being killed by the king's lieutenant. Shades of Thomas à Becket, you might say, in Murdering the Cathedral. But there's another facet of this story which have made some of you prick your ears out. I'd always understood that Crediton was the original seat of the bishops of Devon, yeah? So why is Hooker talking about two bishops who were based at Bishop's Taunton, up near Barnstaple, before the see was removed to Crediton? Now, you'll remember me saying that antiquarians have long been very interested in historical documents. William Chappell, who was a Devon-based antiquarian in the 18th century, took the trouble to look back over previous accounts of the establishment of the bishopric in an effort to sort this out. Chappell noted that the earliest known records, written by William of Malmesbury in 1120 and Roger of Wendover somewhere about 1200, both say that the first bishops of Devon were based in Crediton from 910 CE. Now, most accounts simply repeated that William and Roger said, until Hooker came along with the claim that Werstanus was the first bishop of Devon, based in Bishop's Taunton, and that was from 905 CE. So there's a discrepancy here, there's a 5-year gap between 905, when the bishopric of Devon was established, to 910, when the first recorded bishop of Crediton was inaugurated. Now, Hooker was the first person, writing in about 1584, was the first person to mention there were two bishops at Bishop's Taunton before we had a first bishop of Crediton. And what's more, he's the first person to mention a Bishop Putter and to talk about him having been murdered by someone called Uffa. Well, we don't know where Hooker got his evidence. What we do know is that he may have had access to a source which was not available to earlier writers and which has been lost since, which makes it extremely difficult to check on. We do know that there really was a Bishop Prutter. He's known from contemporary records as the Bishop of Rochester, but he died in 688 CE. So that's more than 2 centuries before the supposed murder of our Devon Prutter. There seems to be no contemporary record of a king's lieutenant or a thane of Devon called Uffa. Now these days we're lucky to have academically respectable databases where we can look these things up. The leading one being Pace, which is I can never say this word, the prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England. They list 2 people called Uffa, but both of them are based at Winchester. It's a curious name, that Uffa. It's just possible, I put it no stronger than that Uffa is a corruption of Ulf here, the guy who's mentioned as the king's faithful minister in that land grant of 974. But if so, the dates don't tie up. He's unlikely to have been murdering a bishop in 905 and dealing with a land grant for the king in 974. In summary, I don't know, and it's impossible to say where Hooker got his story. I suppose we also have to ask ourselves, really, were there 2 bishops of Devon based at Bishop's Taunton before the move to Crediton? Well, some people have said, yep, there's good historical evidence for a bishop's palace at Bishop's Taunton. And indeed there is. If you look on the left-hand side of this map, you will see that the old OS map here shows the remains of a bishop's palace at Bishop's Taunton. But of course, that doesn't mean that Bishop's Taunton was the seat of a bishop. There was a bishop's palace at Chudley, and of course there was one at Crediton, which continued to function long after the bishopric related to Exeter. The bishops of Devon had a lot of palaces. There was also this one at Bishop's Court near Clyst St George. To my eyes, that's a bit of a Victorian monstrosity, but it's built around the core of an ancient episcopal palace, which is sometimes referred to as being the summer palace of the bishops of Exeter. So what I'm saying is that we're not sure if there really was a Bishop of Devon called Prutter, but he's certainly not the man who was the Bishop of Rochester, who died more than 2 centuries earlier. We only have Hooker's account of his murder. There's no corroboration of that anywhere else. And we're unsure as to whether or not there really were 2 bishops of Devon based at Bishop's Taunton. All of which begins to make R.E. Way's assertions about the origins of the Copplestone look a bit dodgy. I can go further than that. You can recall that Way's version is based on 2 previously unconnected claims. Firstly, we have the murder of Bishop's Prutter, and secondly, the association of that murder with the Copplestone. Way was the first person to bring those 2 stories together. And as we saw, Hooker claimed that Prutter was murdered on a journey from Bishop's Taunton to Crediton, but he doesn't say where on that journey. Now, we're quite used, aren't we, to driving up and down the A377. I suppose some people these days prefer to go the long way around on the dual carriageway of the North Devon Link Road and the M5. But we're used to thinking of the A377 as being the main road between Barnstaple and Exeter. But before that road was built, the A377 was built in the 19th century. The route from Barnstaple and Bishop's Taunton to Crediton went over the hills. Here we are on this map, going through Cholmondeley, Watershed Bishop, and on to Crediton. It was based on an historic ridgeway and went nowhere near Copplestone. Now, I can't tell you for certain what route was travelled by a church dignitary on a journey 1,000 years ago, but there's no good reason to think that they would have gone via Copplestone. But You know, you can't overestimate the attractions of a good story. In no time at all, Way's conjecture became the widely accepted version. He had, all credit to him, included all those if, buts and maybes, but they were frequently ignored. By 1882, the Journal of the British Archaeological Association, where Way had published his claims, was casually referring to the Putter Memorial in Devonshire. And the story became increasingly garbled as time went on. As recently as 2003, when English Heritage put their name to an interpretation panel erected near the stone, they said that it was erected about the year 905 as a memorial to Bush Putter, Bishop of Hereford and later Rochester, who was travelling between Crediton and North Taunton when he was attacked and murdered. So they're suggesting that the stone was erected about 905 to commemorate a murder that supposedly took place in 909 of a Bishop of Hereford and later Rochester who had died in 688 when he was on a journey from North Taunton. North Taunton, not Bishop's Taunton. I wish somebody checked that. This is how stories get scrambled, repeated, and taken as gospel. I have to admit that I, for one, would normally cite English Heritage as a reliable source. So look, if we're casting doubts on this explanation, I suppose the next question is there a better explanation? And I'd like to throw in an observation of my own, an alternative theory, if you like, of the origins of Copplestone. Oops, sorry. There are examples of Anglo-Saxon stones, some examples of Anglo-Saxon stones, which are believed to be commemorative or memorial, but they are quite rare. Boundary stones are far more common. And there's another location in Devon called Copplestone, which also lies on an ancient boundary between the hundreds of Tiverton and Holbers. The earliest reference I can find to the place name is from the 16th century, so it's not like somebody's come up with a modern coinage. I would quickly add that the Tiverton Copplestone does not have an extant stone, but of course we don't know how many historic monuments have disappeared over the centuries. I believe that there's a good argument for saying that the shared name Copplestone, here shown against that 100 boundary in the red dotted line just to the right of it. Sorry, I've lost my place here. That shared name Copplestone might suggest that both locations, the Tiverton one and the Crediton one, had ancient stone monuments of some kind which marked important boundaries. Just taking that a bit further, you'll remember me saying that it stands on the line of a major watershed. Just take a look at this map for a second. This red line represents the line of the watershed which runs between the Tor and the Crediton. I can't help noticing that there are 4 stone place names along that line. We've got Brownstone, Knightstone, Rollstone, and Copplestone. Now, is that just a coincidence, or were there once 4 notable marker stones here? Did they just denote the watershed, or was the watershed itself an important boundary in earlier times, with these stones marking points along that boundary? And was the Copplestone the chief stone? Was it the special decorated one, perhaps, the acknowledged meeting place when there were discussions to be had between the two communities? A guy called Masson Phillips, who wrote extensively about crosses and standing stones in Devon in the Transactions of the Devonshire Association, identified several such markers on important watersheds around the county, including one at Tedburn St Mary and another at Cheriton Bishop. So that's 2 more stones which lie on the southeastern edge of the catchment of the River Tor. So, watershed boundary markers. It's just a theory. I can't prove that that's the origin of the Copplestone, and I'd be really interested to hear what other people think. Now, it's often the strangest things that turn out to be true. There really was a curse on anyone who moved to Copplestone. Most Anglo-Saxon charters include something called an anathema. You may know the word in its modern sense, meaning something which you really dislike. The original meaning was a formal curse issued by the church authorities. You can often find them in land grants, warning people against moving boundary markers. And the anathema for the Charter of 974 said, "If anyone therefore shall take it away from the aforesaid place, or in any wise diminish it, may he be stricken with a perpetual curse and perish everlasting with the devil." Gosh. So there you have it, the stone and the story. As I said at the beginning, the Copplestone really is very special. It's a remarkable survivor from the early medieval era. There's lots to say about those unusually good carvings. And it's no wonder that various stories have grown up around it. But as ever with history, you need to remember what is fact and what is conjecture. So that's it from me, and I'd be very pleased to hear your comments and questions. I'll stop screen sharing now. Okay. So if you can let people join us if they want to say anything. I'd be interested to hear any comments that people might have.
Yeah, so if you want to turn on your cameras, if you've got a question, you can either raise your hand or your metaphorical yellow hand, which Tony will be able to see. So in the chat, which is now not opening for me, someone had said that there were other stones around. Right, so it just said that the idea of a landmark being found, the same claim is applied to the Jubilee clock in the square at North Taunton, for example, as the idea of the landmark being the centre of Devon is found in other areas locally. But I can see someone from the museum has their hand up if you'd like to ask your question.
Yep. Do you want to unmute yourselves, museum? Whoever's at the museum, could you unmute yourself if you want to ask that question? Yeah, here we go.
We're unmuted now.
Yep.
This is all very confusing. Yeah, I don't know whether you can see me or not.
I can't see you, but I know where your voice. You're David. Hi, David.
Yes, that's right. You don't have to see me. But what, in fact, Mike's now making sure you can see me, probably us. We are all, well, I say all, there are 5 of us here at this pilot occasion where we're zooming the talk at the museum for anyone who wanted to come along. So we stuck our hand up then because I wanted to say something. Others, I don't know whether anybody else wants to as well. That gives us the opportunity. But obviously we'd have liked more people to be here. But I think those that have been here found that thanks to Mike Brett's brilliance with the equipment, it's worked extremely well. And we were able to hear you very clearly, Tony, and see you very clearly and see the slides. So it's brilliant. Thank you once again for a super talk. What a lot of detailed work you've done. It's fascinating. You've asked as many questions as you've attempted to answer, of course. So, and you've raised lots of queries over comments of many historians in centuries past. But who knows whether we'll ever learn the truth. But you've certainly given us lots to think about. And it was a very suitable talk for this pilot occasion at the museum. Hopefully, subject to the pandemic, we'll continue with these communal Zoom occasions, and maybe they'll be better attended in future. We've got to get used to it, haven't we? But meantime, thanks ever so much for a super report, a super talk. And has anybody else amongst the 5 of us here got any questions to ask or anything to say? No, that looks as though it's it as far as we're concerned. Thanks again.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, your point about there being sort of more questions than answers. Very, very true. And of course, when you're dealing with something that was put up there by unknown person or persons 1,000 years ago, there's bound to be speculation about it. I think the important thing is to see what evidence we have, be that evidence pictorial or in any kind of documentary form, and see what sense we can make of it. So that's what I've endeavoured to do in as even-handed a way as I possibly can. Hope that came across.
Right, we've got 3 questions in the chat. Is there any sort of information about what the crest might have looked like if there was one?
The short answer is no, but it's a very interesting question. As the photographs will have shown you, there has been an indentation, a notch, if you like, set into the top of that stone at some point. I can't say for definite that that's a later addition, but the people from the corpus team believed it to be so. And there are indeed other examples of that. If you go down to Cornwall, there's a stone called King Doniot's stone, which has got similarly a sort of a square, I can't remember the right word, a square sort of indentation into the top of it, which has been broken out in the same way as the Copplestone one has, probably to accommodate a crosshead. Now, I suggest that is more than likely something which was to accentuate the sort of Christian symbolism associated with the cross, possibly somewhat after it had been originally set up there. So whatever that was, it completely destroyed any evidence of the original shape of the top of the stone. Hoskins drew attention to the fact that it may have meant crested. And of course, as I say, I mean, there's just no evidence of any kind to suggest whether or not that was the case, simply because it's been altered at some point in its later history. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, so thanks from Isabel for that one. And Heather is asking, were any of the materials from the plinth support from before the stone was moved retained? Any information on the age or origin of those materials?
Gosh, well, that plinth, yeah, I mean, we can date that pretty accurately because that was mentioned specifically in the report that R.A. King drew up in the 1870s, where he said that the plinth had been erected about 30 years earlier, so sometime in the 1840s or thereabouts. And he doesn't say where they came from, but it was clearly a sort of modern building thing to take it up. And you may recall I said it was to save it from damage. So presumably with there being more traffic around, more wheeled traffic around by the middle of the 19th century, they wanted to make sure that the thing was preserved, but presumably on materials which were nothing particularly special in themselves. As to what happened when that came down, that was only in the 1960s. We may be able to find someone who has, someone alive today who has memories of what happened to those bits of stone, but they weren't particularly special. So I suspect they were just reused somewhere else.
And now we've had a question from Richard. The stone must have been extremely expensive to bring to Copplestone and very expensive to carve. So presumably the stone was very important. Is that a reasonable conclusion? And are there similar expensive contemporary monuments elsewhere in the country?
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this would have been a really big undertaking. Right? It would be a big enough undertaking today. But if you think of what means of transport were available 1,000 years ago, and if you think about the state of the roads and the terrain that they would have had to bring that across, it would have been a massive undertaking. So this was something which would have been expensive to do, difficult to do. You wouldn't have undertaken a job like that lightly. Once you've got it there, you've got someone, person or persons, who has great expertise, probably expensive expertise, in carving all those very intricate decorations on all four faces of the stone. So again, that would have been very important and would only have been done if this stone had considerable importance. We don't have very many in Devon. Devon is particularly poor. That one that I showed you called Toyser's Cross in Exeter, no one is entirely sure where it stood in Exeter. It was found in sometime, I think, in the 19th century when they were doing some work on the ex-bridges. It had been used in an earlier time to strengthen the foundations of the bridge. But there are references to Toyser's Cross, which I think is a corruption of St. Osyth's Cross. That's hard enough to say in itself, no wonder they call it Toyser. Toyser's Cross stood probably at one of the gates to the city of Exeter. Now I have to say that whoever erected the Copplestone, or whoever carved the Copplestone, did a pretty smart job, and it's actually better carved than the one for Exeter. So I think we can be particularly proud of that. But Toyser's Cross is one of the other few remaining examples of decorated stones in Devon. There are others, quite a lot elsewhere in the country. If you should ever look up that corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture, you will find there are a number in the north of England in particular, which are absolutely wonderful. If you ever want to look at a very, very high quality example of a stone from this era, there's one at a place called Bew Castle, B-E-W Castle, which is pretty much on the border between England and Scotland, near Carlisle. Beautifully preserved stone. You can find photographs of it online. That's just one of many which were in the sort of Northumbrian area, which, as you might know, was, if you like, the preeminent kingdom of Anglo-Saxon England in an earlier time, before, if you like, the shift of power moved further and further south and ended up in Wessex. But yeah, there are quite a few around. I have no doubt at all that there are hundreds, if not thousands, which have disappeared over the centuries. But that's not to detract from the fact that our Copplestone is particularly lovely and would have been a major monument even in its day. So it was put there because it was important, an important location.
So Averell was fascinated by the two figures depicted on the stone. One rider has a shield and the other hasn't. One appears to be on a horse, and the Copplestone depiction looks more like a donkey. The early drawings on the Copplestone of the two embracing figures, the left one appears to have a beard. Do you have any thoughts on hers? Okay,
so I mean, certainly when it comes to the two drawings of the figure on horseback, I think I said to you that there are no, I can't, and the people who wrote the corpus couldn't find anything precisely the same as the Copplestone figure on any monuments elsewhere. But I included that one from Chesterley Street as being what they suggested as being a similar figure with something going on above his head. You can see from the guy who had the shield that there were some sorts of mythical creatures above his head. On the Copplestone, all we can see now is that there was something weirdly shaped going on above his head. You're not the only person to comment on the fact that that horse looks like it has quite long legs and maybe a donkey. And that indeed is why some commentators have suggested that it may be a picture of Christ's entry into Jerusalem riding a donkey. I suspect that the image is so eroded now that there may have been all sorts of damage which make it more difficult to be sure what exactly is shown in that picture. But it's a great source of speculation. Now, when it comes to the two embracing figures, it is so difficult to see what the ones on the Copplestone might have looked like. All I can say to you is that comparison with the drawing from Yorkshire, the carving from Yorkshire, which was, I mean, the similarity of the positions of the two characters, the way they are embracing, It's a very, very strong similarity. I can't tell you whether or not someone had a beard or not on the Copplestone, and the one from Yorkshire is also fairly eroded, but there is a striking similarity between those two sculptures.
Ask Liz. And we've got a question from Denise, who says it's fascinating. Her question is concerning design, maybe Celtic or Nordic. What were the cultural influences at the time?
Yeah, a very good point, Denise. The main body of outstanding or extant work now is from Northumbria and the north of England, and there is a big crossover between Celtic and Scandinavian designs in that era. Quite a lot of people have commented on the fact that the Copplestone does appear to have some of those designs on it have echoes of Viking or Scandinavian patterns. A guy called Derek Gore, who used to teach at the university, wrote a book on the Vikings in the West Country, and he suggested that whether or not there were literally Vikings traveling around the country spreading those patterns, or whether they were just picked up and adopted by others, it's really impossible to say. But certainly the legacy of those designs became quite blended over the centuries.
And Isabel wonders, is there any technological equipment now which can photograph and clarify what is left of the eroded sculpting?
That's a jolly good question. I have no idea. It would be well worth exploring that. If anyone's got any contacts with the person who might have equipment to do that, please put them in touch. I'd be delighted to see if we could find out more about those decorations. That'd be great.
And Mark says, were the stones from the modern base mount used as part of the road junction alterations hardcore, or did I imagine hearing that?
Well, I certainly didn't say that, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were. Good old bits of stone like that. There were quite a lot of them. You wouldn't want to move them any further than you had to.
And he thinks that the Lidford Viking stones are of a similar Anglo-Saxon age. And there's also a Maniton churchyard cross, which possibly has similar threadwork, but is now badly eroded. Right,
okay. I don't know that one. I mean, certainly there are a number of other old crosses. Some of them are very, very eroded indeed. But your best bet, if you want to look at those, you can find that book, the Corpus of Anglo-Saxon Stone Sculpture. You can find it online. They've shared it. It's all available for free. You have to play your way through it, but you can look up individual stones on it, and it really is a wonderful source if you're interested in specific monuments. So, apart from some thank yous, and there's a link to legendary Dartmoor co.uk lid Viking for the Lidford ones in the chat, if anybody wants to copy that link. Okay, lovely, splendid. Thank you. So that's the ones from the chat, yeah? Yeah, they're in the chat. It's nice. Okay. www.legendarydartmoor. And you can see it in the chat. Yep, that's quite a useful site, that one. Well worth looking at. Thank you. Now I saw Dave Bressington had his hand up a minute ago, but he's disappeared from sight at the moment. I don't know if he's still got a question for me there.
Yeah, I have, Tony. Tony, thanks very much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. As you know, I mean, we've lived in Copplestone for many years. Now, in 1992, Copplestone became a parish within its own right, and we set up, we put up a boundary stone to celebrate that several years ago, and the stone itself, we got that from a local farmer, and he said it was quarried from Blackenstone quarry, Dartmoor's only working quarry now. And the conjecture then, when I was talking about, I wonder if the stone the Copplestone, was initially quarried from, came out from Blackenstone. And if you look at the distance, why would they bring a stone 30 odd miles from Merivale when there's a quarry out at Blackenstone, which is only 19 miles away? And I'm wondering, is there any, you know, on what basis did you suggest it was quarried at Merivale? Is there anything to kind of support that, or was that again on your part suggesting it would have been Merivale at the time?
Thanks, Dave. No, certainly, it's certainly not my suggestion. That is one which I don't set myself as any kind of geologist. That's one which comes from a chap who many of you will know, Richard Scrivener, who was previously with the British Geological Survey and who lives locally. I believe Richard's still with us. And that was his conclusion. He says there are very specific types of granite which are identifiable to different locations.
Okay.
And that was his conclusion.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to squirrel through to see if I can find any other hands up. I don't notice, so shout now if anybody has any further questions. Okay, that looks like that's it.
Well, thanks ever so much, Tony. As in the chat, very interesting, informative talk and discussion. Thank you. Things along, as always, beautifully researched and presented talk. And someone's first Zoom lecture, so interesting and informative.
Excellent.
So if you want to virtually clap Tony Gale or in person, then please do.